Hey everyone. Born on June 12, 1929 in Frankfurt, Germany, Anne Frank was truly one of the most inspiring and important people in modern history. Frank grew up during the reign of Adolf Hitler and his sadistic Nazi government, and she was forced to live most of the final years of her life tucked away in an attic in Amsterdam, hiding with her family. They stayed there for over 2 years until the Nazis discovered them in August 1944. Today, let's find out about how were the last final months of Anne Frank. Let's start the video, but before that, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like this video. Frank originally came to prominence in the United States in the 1950s following the publication of the diary she had kept while in the Amsterdam attic. Unfortunately, due to the circumstances of her death, it's unknown exactly which day she died in 1945. For decades, it was thought that both Frank and her sister passed sometimes in March 1945 due to typhus. However, newer research indicates that it may instead have been closer to February when they both succumbed to illness. We don't know a lot about Frank's final days, and the little bit we do is largely from eyewitnesses' accounts, which paints a horrifying and tragic picture. When Anne Frank was only 13 years old, she had to start hiding in an attic to escape the Nazis. That was in July 1942, and the month prior, her father gave her a diary for her birthday, which she started using immediately. She did not journal in the diary every single day, but she did write quite frequently considering her conditions at the time. Her entries display not only her vulnerability and understanding of the horrifying reality she was enduring, but also show that even in her captivity, she was still able to learn a good deal about what was happening. Her family had access to a radio in the attic, which they could tune in to the BBC transmissions from England, and that helped them keep apprised about some of what was going on outside their confined walls. In one of her more poignant entries from June 6, 1944, Frank wrote about the D-Day offensive being launched by the Allies in France, which made her hopeful about the possibility of leaving the annex and returning to school within a few months. On July 21, 1944, she showed she was aware of the July 20th plot on Adolf Hitler's life, which made her confident that the war and Holocaust would soon be over. Her final journal entry was on August 1st, and she was placed under arrest on August 4th, 1944 by Nazi authorities. Anne Frank and her family were arrested on August 4th, 1944 by the Nazis, and just a few months later, she would reach her final destination at the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, where she would ultimately perish. After arresting them, the Nazis sent the Frank family first to a prison camp and then a detention center. And on September 3, 1944, they were part of a group of just over 1,000 Jewish men, women, and children who were sent to the infamous Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp. While at Auschwitz, Anne lived under constant threat of being sent to the gas chambers, and their living conditions were predictably appalling. The Nazis provided them with little food and water, not even enough to really survive, and Anne ended up coming down with scabies due to the filth. Her sister, Margaret Frank, helped to take care of her, and they were also with their mother, Edith Frank, though they were separated from their father, Otto Frank. While Anne was still sick, the Nazis took both her and Margaret from Auschwitz on October 28, 1944, and sent them to Bergen-Belsen. While Bergen-Belsen was not an extermination camp like Auschwitz, by the time the Franks got there, conditions had devolved so much that inmates were constantly dying of sickness and disease. Sadly, by the time the Allies would finally liberate Bergen-Belsen months later, both Margaret and Anne would be dead from illnesses they contracted due to the unsanitary conditions. For Jewish children like Anne Frank, who were deported to concentration camps during the Holocaust, undoubtedly one of the most psychological torturous aspects was their lack of knowledge about the fate of their family and friends. When the Nazis took Anne into custody in 1944, she had been living with, among others, like her mother Edith Frank and sister Margaret Frank, and they were all arrested together. Anne was certain that the Nazis had gassed her father Otto to death, and she was incredibly upset about losing them. As it would turn out, Edith would pass away at Auschwitz in January 1945, while Otto would survive through the end of the war. It was Otto who would eventually get Anne's diary published in 1947, and he would pass away himself in 1980. As incredible as it might sound, in light of how famous it has become in the decades since her death, Anne Frank actually wanted her diary to be published. While Frank was hiding inside the secret annex, one of the few windows she had to the outside world was the use of a radio. This was well before the days of internet or even widespread TV, so radio stations like the BBC from London, England were one of the primary sources of news, especially for those in hiding. Frank had aspirations of becoming a writer, and she was very excited about the possibility of her diary being published even during her darkest days of imprisonment. Sadly, Frank would die in the Holocaust before getting a chance to live out her dreams, but posthumously, her diary has become one of the most important sources available on the Holocaust. Hundreds of prisoners were dying daily, too many to cremate, and bodies began piling up around the camp. This was a haven for disease, and lice and fleas infested many camp prisoners. Due to the inadequate clothing, many prisoners were also subjected to the frostbite in the winter conditions, and Frank's own quarters were leaky and did a poor job against the elements. Anne Frank's heroic story came to a tragic end at the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp when she was just 15 years old. It's unknown exactly when Anne became infected, but since it takes about 2 to 3 weeks for typhus to turn fatal, she more than likely became ill in either late January or early February 1945. A few days before dying, Anne hallucinated from her severe fever and she threw out her clothes, which were infested with lice and fleas. However, she had nothing to replace them with, leaving her to wrap herself in a single blanket as her only protection from the elements. Anne died a day or two after Margaret and about 2 months before liberation. Initially, her death was listed on March 31, 1945, but historians now believe it was about a month and a half earlier in mid-February. Either way, her legacy continues to live on decades later as an inspiration to millions and as a tragic reminder of the horrifying atrocities of the Holocaust. Well, that's it for today. I hope you're liking Nerdies discoveries. Can't wait for the next video to learn more and be fascinated about. See you on the next. Bye.